It began like any other casual gathering at Emily's. Emily, my closest friend since high school, has always been the queen of parties and laid-back hangouts. However, this time, the atmosphere felt different. Her boyfriend, Ethan, was present. Ethan had always been a friendly guy, maybe a bit too friendly sometimes, but I brushed it off. He was Emily's boyfriend, after all. The three of us spent the evening together, sharing laughter and enjoying the summer night. At some point during the second movie, Emily dozed off on the couch, leaving Ethan and me alone. I tried to ignore the strange feeling in the air, something I couldn't quite define. We stayed in the living room, whispering to avoid waking her. Our conversation shifted, becoming more intimate, as though Emily's absence had altered everything. Ethan edged closer on the couch. I told myself it was harmless, but when I looked at him, the change was palpable. His eyes lingered on mine, my heart quickened. Then, without a second thought, he leaned in, and his lips were on mine. I froze, my mind reeling, trying to comprehend what was happening. Yet, I didn't pull away. For a fleeting moment, everything else vanished. The room, Emily asleep nearby. It all faded. It was just Ethan and me, and a kiss that should never have happened. When we finally broke apart, reality struck hard. "Ethan, no," I whispered, my voice unsteady. "We can't." Ethan's expression revealed no remorse. He looked almost serene. "I know," he replied softly, but I couldn't stop what had started. The days following the kiss were agonizing. Every encounter with Emily twisted the guilt inside me, a constant reminder of my secret. She was my best friend. How could I betray her like this? How could I have kissed her boyfriend? I couldn't escape the guilt, but neither could I stop thinking about Ethan. It should have been a one-time mistake, a lapse in judgment I would regret and never repeat. But it wasn't that simple. Ethan started texting me, and I found myself replying, despite knowing it was wrong. Our conversations began casually, pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. One night, a text from Ethan arrived. "Can we meet? I need to talk to you." I knew it was a terrible idea. Meeting him would only complicate matters, but I couldn't refuse. I needed to see him, to understand the meaning behind that kiss. I made an excuse to Emily and met Ethan at a cafe across town, far enough away to avoid recognition. The moment I saw him, my heart pounded like it had that night. We sat in silence, the weight of what we'd done hanging between us. "I can't stop thinking about you," Ethan finally confessed, his voice low. I swallowed hard, guilt surging again. "Ethan, this is wrong. You're with Emily." "I know," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "But I can't pretend I don't feel something for you. Can you?" I looked away, my mind racing. This was my best friend's boyfriend. How had things spiraled so far out of control? But the truth was, I felt it too, something that frightened me. "We can't do this," I whispered, though deep down, I wasn't sure I meant it. Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. "We already are." He was right. We'd crossed the line, and I didn't know if we could ever go back. As time passed, the secret between Ethan and me grew heavier, a constant burden. Every time I was with Emily, the guilt gnawed at me, threatening to tear me apart. Yet, despite my efforts to stop, I couldn't get Ethan out of my head. We continued to find excuses to meet, quick coffee runs, late-night texts that escalated into something more. It was wrong, we both knew it, but we couldn't stop. One evening, Emily invited me for dinner at her apartment, just the three of us. I almost declined, knowing how uncomfortable it would be, but I couldn't avoid my best friend forever. I arrived, feigning normalcy, but the moment I saw Ethan, my stomach churned. The tension between us was palpable, yet we had to conceal it from Emily. The night crawled by. Emily was her usual cheerful self, utterly unaware of the turmoil brewing before her. It made me sick. When Emily left the room to get dessert, Ethan and I were alone. The silence was thick, the air charged with unspoken words. Ethan glanced at me, his eyes dark. "We can't keep doing this," he whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. He seemed as conflicted as I felt. "I know," I murmured, my heart pounding. But even as we spoke the words, we knew they were hollow. We'd crossed the line, and there was no turning back. The more time we spent together, the deeper we fell into this mess. Emily returned, laughing about something she'd seen on TV, oblivious to the storm brewing right in front of her. I forced a smile, but with each glance at her, the guilt intensified, crushing me like a wave. How much longer could we maintain this charade? Ethan's leg brushed against mine under the table, and I caught my breath. It was subtle, but enough. That small touch sent a jolt through me, a stark reminder of everything we were hiding. We couldn't continue this charade, yet I wasn't convinced I could stop. After dinner, the situation grew even more complex. Emily's laughter, her kindness, her unwavering trust in both Ethan and me, it all pressed heavily on my conscience. I attempted to create distance, to avoid getting too close to Ethan, but temptation was a constant presence, lurking in every shared glance, every subtle touch. A few days later, Emily invited Ethan and me to join her for a weekend getaway at her family's lake house. I hesitated, knowing the proximity to both of them for an entire weekend would be agonizing. However, Emily's enthusiasm was infectious, and declining would have aroused suspicion. I agreed, dreading the potential consequences. The lake house was everything Emily had described, peaceful, secluded, and immersed in nature. We spent the day swimming and relaxing by the water, but the tension between Ethan and me was undeniable. Every time our eyes met, the air crackled with anticipation, a sense of inevitability. That evening, after Emily retired early, exhausted from the day's activities, Ethan and I found ourselves by the lake. The moonlight shimmered on the water, casting an ethereal glow, and the silence between us was heavy with unspoken words. "We need to talk about this," I finally said, breaking the quiet, my heart pounding. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the water. "I know," he replied softly. "But what do we say? What do we do?" I had no answers. Everything about this situation was wrong. Ethan was my best friend's boyfriend. We had no right to be here, alone, late at night, sharing secrets that could devastate Emily if she ever discovered them. But the truth was, I didn't want it to end. "You and Emily," I started, my voice trailing off. "You guys are good together." Ethan turned to me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't decipher. Regret, perhaps, or something deeper. "She's great," he admitted, "but something's changed." I swallowed hard, understanding precisely what he meant. I felt it too. The attraction between us was undeniable, and we both knew it had evolved from a single mistake into something more. Acknowledging it aloud, however, would make it real, and I wasn't prepared for that. Ethan reached out, his fingers lightly grazing mine. That simple touch sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could stop myself, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. The kiss was electric, charged with all the pent-up emotions we'd been suppressing for weeks. But the moment it happened, guilt washed over me again. I pulled back, breathless, shaking my head. "We can't do this," I whispered, even though my body craved more. Ethan's eyes met mine, conflicted. "I know," he said, but neither of us moved. The kiss by the lake felt like a breaking point, an admission that we'd gone too far. Yet neither of us wanted to stop. As much as guilt gnawed at me, as much as the thought of Emily crushed me, being with Ethan felt impossible to resist. There was a magnetic pull between us, drawing me toward him even when I knew I should be running in the opposite direction. The remainder of the weekend was strained. Emily, of course, suspected nothing, laughing and joking with us, oblivious to the secret affair unfolding behind her back. Every smile she offered only intensified the guilt. But every time I saw Ethan, My heart raced with that forbidden thrill. We maintained our distance, avoiding being alone together, but the chemistry between us was impossible to ignore. Even the slightest brush of hands as we passed in the kitchen felt like a spark that could ignite at any moment, and I couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. The taste of it lingered, haunting me. On the final night at the lake house, things finally came to a head. Emily went to bed early again, and I knew the inevitable was approaching. As soon as she was out of sight, Ethan found me on the porch, gazing at the moonlit water. My heart pounded before he even spoke. "We can't keep doing this," I said quietly, echoing the words I'd been telling myself for days. But even as I said them, I knew they weren't true. I didn't want to stop. Ethan sat beside me, his knee brushing mine, sending that familiar rush of heat through me. "I don't want to hurt Emily," he said, his voice low and serious. "But I can't stop thinking about you. About us." His words hit me hard, a mixture of desire and guilt churning within me. I knew we were in too deep. What had started as a kiss had become so much more. I couldn't look at Emily without feeling like a terrible person, but I couldn't look at Ethan without feeling like I was drowning in everything we hadn't said. "I know it's wrong," I whispered, "but I feel it too." And there it was, the truth we'd both been concealing. The words hung between us, heavy with significance. As the silence deepened, Ethan's hand reached out, finding mine, and I let him hold it, feeling the weight of the secret we now shared. We sat there for what felt like hours, neither of us willing to break the spell. I knew we were standing on the precipice of something dangerous, but I also knew there was no turning back. After that night at the lake house, I thought things would return to normal. I told myself it was a one-time lapse, a moment of weakness we could overcome. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Ethan and I had crossed a line, and there was no pretending otherwise. The week after we returned, I tried to avoid Ethan. I reasoned that distance might clear my head, help me decide what to do. But the more I tried to stay away, the more I thought about him, constantly checking my phone, hoping for a message, a reason to see him again. Then one evening, the message arrived. "Can we talk? I need to see you." My heart pounded with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Meeting him again was a bad idea. I knew it would only complicate things, but I couldn't resist. I agreed to meet at a small, secluded park outside of town. When I saw Ethan waiting for me, my stomach twisted with excitement and guilt. I approached slowly, unsure what to say. But the moment our eyes met, I knew this was no longer just about a kiss. There was something deeper between us, something I wasn't sure I could control. Ethan looked as conflicted as I felt, hands shoved in his pockets as he leaned against a tree. "I've been thinking about you every day," he admitted, his voice low. "I don't know what to do. I feel torn." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "You're with Emily," I reminded him, even though the words felt hollow. "We shouldn't be doing this." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but I can't stop thinking about you. About us. It's like something's missing with her." My heart ached at his words. I wanted to tell him to stop, to end this before it went any further. But instead, I stepped closer, the pull between us undeniable. "Ethan, My words caught in my throat as he closed the distance between us. Before I could say anything else, he kissed me again. This time it was different. Deeper. More intense. It wasn't just about desire. It felt like surrendering to everything we'd been holding back for weeks. When we finally pulled apart, breathless, I knew we were in too deep. This wasn't just a fling. It was something real, something we couldn't ignore. And the worst part was, I didn't want to stop. As the secret affair between Ethan and me intensified, the guilt became unbearable. Every time I saw Emily, it felt like a punch to the gut. She was my best friend, someone who trusted me implicitly, and I was betraying her in the worst possible way. I had always considered myself a loyal friend, someone who would never cross that line. But now, Every glance Ethan and I shared felt like we were teetering on the edge of a cliff, one step away from disaster. Despite the guilt, I couldn't stop. I told myself each time would be the last, but every encounter with Ethan was like a magnet drawing us together. We met secretly whenever possible, always careful to keep Emily in the dark. The more we saw each other, the more it became than just desire. It was something deeper, something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. One evening, Emily invited me over for dinner. She was her usual bubbly self, chatting about her day and expressing excitement for a weekend trip she'd planned with Ethan. I forced a smile, trying to act normal, but the weight of my secret made it difficult to breathe. As the night progressed, Ethan arrived, and the tension between us was palpable. We exchanged brief glances, but nothing more. Emily, completely oblivious, continued talking, laughing, and making plans for the future. Every word she spoke made my stomach churn. At one point, while Emily was in the kitchen, Ethan and I were left alone. The air crackled with tension, and I could feel the guilt rising in my throat. "We need to stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Ethan didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the floor. "I know," he said quietly, but there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. "But can we?" I didn't answer. The truth was, I didn't know if we could. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to pull away. But I knew we were on borrowed time. Sooner or later, Emily would find out, and when she did, everything would fall apart. Emily returned, unaware of the turmoil beneath the surface. She handed us drinks and sat down, smiling as if nothing in the world could be wrong. As I looked at her, the guilt became overwhelming, and I realized we couldn't keep this up much longer. Something had to give, and when it did, it wouldn't be pretty. The following days were filled with suffocating tension. Every time I was around Emily, my chest tightened with the weight of my lies. Every time I saw Ethan, the temptation to be near him grew stronger, even though I knew how dangerous it was. I could feel the end approaching, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong move would send everything crashing down. Emily had planned another casual hangout at her place, just like old times. It was supposed to be the three of us again, but I dreaded the thought of sitting there, pretending everything was normal. As I arrived that evening, I sensed something different in the air. Emily greeted me with her usual bright smile, but there was a strange energy lingering between the three of us. Ethan was quieter than usual, his eyes barely meeting mine. The night dragged on, each conversation feeling forced, as though we were all walking on eggshells. We all danced around the unspoken truth. Emily, oblivious, chattered excitedly about her future with Ethan, her words a painful twist in my gut with each passing syllable. I knew our secret could shatter her world. Midway through the evening, Emily's mom called, and she excused herself to take the call in private. The moment she left, the air between Ethan and me crackled with unbearable tension. Alone again, the same suffocating weight settled upon us. Ethan rose and walked to the window, his back to me, staring out at the night. "This is killing me," he murmured, his voice laced with inner turmoil. I stood too, pacing restlessly, my nerves frayed. "We have to stop, Ethan," I whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "We can't keep doing this to her. We're going to get caught." Ethan turned, his expression a blend of frustration and misery. "I know," he admitted, stepping closer, "but I don't know how to stop. Every time I see you, I want to be with you." His confession sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. A part of me yearned to run, to end this destructive cycle, but another part, a part I despised, clung to him. Before I could reply, the door opened and Emily returned. The sudden shift in the atmosphere was palpable. My heart hammered against my ribs. She glanced between us, her smile faltering slightly, as though sensing the unspoken tension. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice light but tinged with caution. I forced a smile, nodding quickly. "Yeah, everything's fine." But I knew we were on borrowed time. The The charged atmosphere between Ethan and me was too potent, too evident. Sooner or later, Emily would discover the truth, and when she did, everything would collapse. As the days crawled by, the pressure became agonizing. Every interaction with Emily felt like treading on thin ice, terrified of letting the truth slip, yet aware that the cracks in our fabricated reality were widening. I could see it in her occasional glances, a flicker of suspicion, a hesitation in her laughter. She hadn't voiced her concerns, but something was clearly amiss. Ethan and I hadn't spoken since that strained evening at her apartment, but the silence only amplified the guilt. The more I tried to suppress it, the more it consumed me. Sleepless nights and a gnawing anxiety became my constant companions. The guilt, the attraction, the fear of exposure. It was a tangled mess, pulling me apart. Then one evening, Emily called, her voice subdued. "Can you come over? I need to talk to you," she said. The tone of her voice sent a chill down my spine. I hesitated, but I knew I couldn't evade her forever. When I arrived, the apartment felt heavy with unspoken tension. Emily wasn't there to greet me with her usual warmth. Instead, she stood by the kitchen counter, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Anger, hurt, suspicion. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, struggling to maintain composure. "We need to talk," she stated, her voice level but colder than I'd ever heard it. My stomach twisted into knots. "Emily, what's going on?" She looked at me, her eyes hardening. "Something's been off for a while now between you and Ethan." My heart stopped. She knew. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm, to perpetuate the lie a little longer. "What do you mean?" Emily stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "I'm not stupid," she said, her voice rising. "I've seen the way you look at each other, how you act when I'm not around. Just tell me the truth. Have you and Ethan—" She couldn't finish, her voice choked with emotion. I swallowed hard, the truth a crushing weight. The room seemed to shrink, every second stretching into an eternity. I could lie again, deny everything, try to salvage what remained of our friendship. But looking at her, the friend I had betrayed, I knew I couldn't keep running. I took a deep breath, my voice a bare whisper. "Emily, I'm so sorry." Her face crumpled, a mixture of betrayal and devastation. "How could you?" she whispered, tears welling up. "How could you do this to me?" I had no answer. There were no words to justify my actions, nothing to undo the pain I had inflicted. In that moment, everything shattered. The affair, the lies, the guilt. It all came crashing down, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. Emily's reaction was as devastating as I'd feared, watching her crumble before me, her eyes filled with betrayal, shattering the fragile world I'd built on deceit. The silence that followed my confession felt like an insurmountable barrier between us. "How long?" she finally asked, her voice small and broken. I could barely meet her gaze, but I owed her the truth. "A few weeks," I admitted, my own voice trembling with guilt. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to happen. Emily laughed bitterly, wiping at her eyes. "A mistake? You kissed my boyfriend, and you kept it from me. Do you even understand what you've done?" Her words cut deep. There was nothing I could say to defend myself. I had betrayed my best friend in the worst possible way. The weight of my lies crushed me, and the reality of losing Emily finally sank in. "I never wanted to hurt you," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Thick with remorse, Emily shook her head, tears coursing down her cheeks. "You didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything. I trusted you, and you betrayed me. I can never forgive you for this." The finality in her words struck me like a physical blow. I wanted to plead for forgiveness, to explain that it wasn't supposed to go this far, but the reality was stark. There was no undoing what I had done. I had crossed a line, and now I had to face the repercussions. At that moment, the door swung open, and Ethan entered, completely oblivious to the devastation that had unfolded. He stopped short, taking in Emily's tear-streaked face, his gaze darting between us. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Emily turned to him, her voice trembling with fury. "You're going to have to explain that to him," she said to me, her tone glacial. I looked at Ethan, guilt flooding my chest. He knew. He saw it in my eyes before a word was spoken. His face paled, and the weight of everything crashed down on him too. "Emily, Ethan began, but she cut him off, her voice shaking with rage. "Don't!" she snapped. "Just don't! I'm done with both of you." And just like that, it was over. Emily stormed out, leaving Ethan and me standing amidst the wreckage of our actions. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan turned to me, his expression a mixture of regret and bewilderment. "What do we do now?" I shook my head, the enormity of the situation sinking in. "I don't know," I whispered, but deep down, I knew we had both lost something irreplaceable. The truth was out, and the cost was everything. This story serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of betrayal and the intricate web of human emotions. We often make impulsive choices in the heat of the moment, believing we can control the outcome, but once the line is crossed, there's no turning back. As you reflect on this narrative, consider how far you're willing to go for desire and the price you're prepared to pay. Remember, relationships are founded on trust, and once that trust is shattered, it can be impossible to mend. Take a moment to consider the choices you make in your own relationships and whether they align with your values. If you found this story compelling and desire more thought-provoking narratives, subscribe to our channel and enable notifications for more powerful tales exploring love, loss, and the human condition.